Today we are going to learn about the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. So I don't want to go too far back in the history of Cuba, but I do want to mention that the United States backed a military dictatorship in Cuba ruled by a man named Batista. Here he is, all through the 1950s. And at this moment, I kind of want to make you take a moment to compare the idea that we're backing a military dictatorship in Cuba with what we talked about as far as the principles of American foreign policy at the beginning of the Cold War. So I hope when you look at these principles that you see that maybe the supporting of a dictatorship rather than a democracy may be in violation of some of our principles, and that violation may turn out to cause us some trouble. And it starts to cause us trouble in 1959. 1959 is the year that this man, Fidel Castro, and his brother Raul, along with their friend Che Guevara, organized and implemented a coup d'etat and overthrew the American-backed military dictator of Cuba. It was also the year that Castro came to Washington, D.C. He was invited by members of the media to come and give some speeches, and so he came there, hopefully to meet with the President of the United States, but the President at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, went golfing instead. And so Castro met with the then Vice President, Richard Nixon. It was Nixon who decided at the end of this meeting that Castro was not an ally of the United States. In fact, he was aligning himself with the Soviet Union, and that something had to be done to contain the expansion of Soviet communism into the American sphere of influence. Almost immediately, the CIA began to draw plans to get rid of Castro as the leader of Cuba, and the plan that they came up with became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. So let me try to explain to you the plan that the CIA came up with. So here's a map of Cuba, and here was the plan. Many Cubans had fled Cuba when Castro took over. They had fled to the United States, which is 90 miles to the north, and they fled to other parts of Central America, which is just off to the west here of Cuba. The CIA rounded up many of these Cuban refugees and began training them in military tactics. And once they were ready to go, the United States was going to send these the CIA-trained Cubans to invade Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. Part of the invasion attack was going to be American planes painted as Cuban Air Force planes protecting the Cuban refugees, the CIA-trained refugees, as they made landfall here in Cuba. Once the Cubans then landed at the Bay of Pigs, they would set up what's called a provisional government, a temporary government on the island of Cuba. Once that was done, the United States would recognize that provisional government as the official government of Cuba. And once that was the official government of Cuba, that new official government of Cuba would then call their friends, the United States, for help and ask the United States military to come and help them restore order in their country. That was the plan that was developed in 1959 and into 1960 to get rid of Castro and the communist threat in our sphere of influence. The one variable in the plan was the fact that there was an election for a new president in 1960. Eisenhower was being term limited out, and so everyone knew that his vice president, Richard Nixon, was going to run for president. And then it turns out another young senator from Massachusetts named John Kennedy runs against him. This is a very interesting campaign. It's the first campaign with televised presidential debates. You can see here by this picture they both are relatively young men. Both are strong anti-communists. Both have a history of success in American government. And so when the election votes are counted, it's very close. Here is the election results. The blue states are states won by Kennedy. The red states are states won by Nixon. And this is one of the closest presidential elections in history. But you probably know by now that John Kennedy wins this election and he is sworn in as president. You've already done a module on his inaugural address where he talked about paying any price, bearing any burden, supporting any friend, opposing any foe in the defense of freedom and democracy. And so when the CIA presented him with the Bay of Pigs plan, he approved it and sent it forward, and the plan was ready to take effect. So Kennedy authorizes the invasion to begin April 17th, 1961, and on that date the CIA-trained Cuban refugees are put on a boat in Central America and are sent over to Cuba, waiting for the American planes to support them. Kennedy knew, though, that any American involvement in an attack on Cuba could result in larger Cold War attacks, such as maybe an attack on Berlin or other places. So he canceled the air support that was to be provided by American planes, and with that allowed every one of the CIA-trained Cubans who were attacking Cuba to be killed or arrested. Now Kennedy knows what he did, and he takes full responsibility for the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. But people begin to wonder about his inaugural address. Then, is he really willing to pay any price or bear any burden, support any friend or oppose any foe? And much like the conflicts that happened after we lost China, this is somewhat some people say that this helped Kennedy to decide that maybe we needed to do more in Vietnam, which we'll get to next week. The CIA, though, was not done with Cuba, and so they developed some new plans to how to deal with a communist Cuba. One of those plans was called Operation Mongoose. Operation Mongoose was a covert attempt to get rid of Fidel Castro as the leader of Cuba, and they did this in many ways. They tried to embarrass him by lacing his cigars with LSD, hoping that he would look foolish on Cuban TV and that people would want to replace him. There were attempts to kill him as well, to assassinate him as well, but those all failed. And so all of this leads up to October of 1962, which is what we'll deal with in Module 4. As we finish this part of the Cold War, I want you to think of these questions. Are we living up to our principles of the American foreign policy outlined by the Truman Doctrine as a result of the Bay of Pigs invasion? Or are we sacrificing our principles to try to win a short-term victory here in Cuba? This is only going to get worse in our next module, and then even worse next week when we talk about Vietnam. But now answer the question on Moodle about the Bay of Pigs and move on to the next module.